I walked into Mr. Rogers' class and found my usual spot in the third row. As the other students took their places, Mr. Rogers stood at the front of the room getting ready for the lesson. Mr. Rogers wasn't like most of the other teachers at our school. There was something quiet and intense about him that made him stand out. He was known as a strict, no-nonsense teacher, and his piercing eyes could silence a classroom in seconds. But under that strict exterior, there was a warmth and kindness that he didn't show very often, but it started to show when he looked at me. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was because I was one of his best students and he liked that I cared about the subject and participated in class. But over time, things started to change. At first, it was just a quick glance, but every once in a while, his eyes would lock with mine across the room. And for a split second, it felt like there was no class, no other students, just me and him. I would look away quickly, not sure what I was feeling, and tell myself it was all in my head. One afternoon, though, the looks turned into something more. It was Friday. During the last part of the day, everyone was antsy and looking forward to the weekend. Mr. Roger gave the class a long assignment to work on and then sat down at his desk to grade papers. I was having trouble with a question, so I raised my hand. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine, and I felt a strange flutter in my chest. He nodded, motioning for me to come over. I stood up and walked to his desk, the classroom suddenly feeling much smaller and more personal. When I got to him, he leaned in close and asked, "Which question is giving you trouble?" His breath warm on my cheek. I pointed to a page in my textbook, but my mind was racing because he was so close that it was hard to concentrate. He patiently explained the answer, but I could barely pay attention because all I could think about was how close he was and how his arm lightly touched mine as he pointed to the paper. The bell rang, waking me up. The kids began to pack up, eager to get out of school and start the weekend. Slowly putting my things together, I tried to get rid of the strange feeling that had come over me. "I want to talk to you about your work, mister," Roger said in a soft but firm voice. Freeze. As the last pupils left the classroom, my heart raced. Soon there would only be the two of us, and the room would feel different, quieter, heavy, and different. Unsure of what to say, I turned to face him. "Your assignments have been great lately," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You've really been standing out." I smiled awkwardly. It was always awkward for me when teachers complimented me, but the way Mr. Roger was looking at me made it even harder to find the right words. He got up, walked around his desk, and leaned against the front of it. He crossed his arms and never took his eyes off of me. He spoke in a low voice. "I see something in you." It was something different. I had to swallow hard to stay calm. What was he trying to say? Before I could answer, the door to the class opened. When the door creaked open, another teacher walked in and asked Mr. Roger a question about the upcoming staff meeting. The moment was broken, and I quickly gathered my things, mumbling something about needing to leave. As I walked out of the classroom, my mind was racing with what had just happened. Was it just a normal conversation, or was there something more? The way he looked at me and the way he spoke made it feel like he was trying to say something but couldn't. I couldn't stop thinking about it all weekend. I shut my eyes. I knew something had changed because of the way his eyes looked into mine and the way his voice softened when he spoke to me, but I didn't know how far things would go when Monday came around. I had been worrying about going back to Mr. Rogers' class all weekend because I kept thinking about our last conversation and how I felt like there was something more behind his words that I wasn't supposed to understand. I got to class early to try to collect my thoughts before the lesson started, but Mr. Roger was already there, sitting at his desk and going over some papers. When I walked in, his eyes briefly lit up, and for a split second I thought I saw something other than his face recognition or something deeper. But just as quickly, his expression went back to its usual stern calmness. I sat down where I always do and tried to concentrate on the upcoming lesson. Other students slowly came in and started talking, but my mind was somewhere else. I was waiting for him to talk to me again, for another look that stayed too long, for something I couldn't quite put into words. The class started, but I kept losing focus. Mr. Roger looked at me. It felt like he was paying more attention to me than normal. Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? About halfway through class, he gave us another task to do that would keep us all busy until the end of the period. I looked down at my textbook to focus, but my mind was racing. I could feel him at the front of the room, and every once in a while I dared to sneak a look at him. That's when it happened again. His eyes met mine for a second, and he didn't look away. It felt like time had stopped, and the sounds of the classroom seemed to slow down. As he faded into the background, I quickly looked down at my book. My heart was racing. What was going on? Why did it feel like he was trying to say something without words? The rest of the period went by without a hitch, but I could barely focus. When the bell finally rang to end class, I felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. As I was packing up my things, I heard Mr. Rogers' voice again. "Can you stay for a moment?" he asked in a way that was loud enough for the whole class to hear, but not so loud that it would have been a red flag. My heart skipped a beat as the other students left the classroom, their talks filling the hallway. Soon it would just be the two of us in the classroom again when I heard the door click. As the door closed behind the last student, the air seemed to get heavier, just like it had on Friday. I turned to face him, my heart racing. He didn't sit down this time. Instead, he stood by his desk and watched me closely. There was something unreadable in his expression that made me both nervous and interested. "You've been doing really well in this class," he said in a low, measured voice, "but I've noticed you're distracted." I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Distracted, Ed, of course I was distracted. How could I not be? Every time I walked into this classroom, I felt this invisible tension. "I guess I've just had a lot on my mind," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I see. Is there something you'd like to talk about that's bothering you?" I wasn't sure how to answer. What was I supposed to say? The way he looked at me made my heart race, and I didn't know why, but I felt like something was going on between us that neither of us could explain. I finally shook my head and said, "I'm fine," but I knew it wasn't completely true. I wasn't fine. I was confused, scared, and more than a little interested in what was going on. He looked at me for a moment longer, his eyes intense as if he were looking for something in my expression. Then he took a step closer, pulling us closer together just enough to make me realize how small the room suddenly felt. "I want you to know," he said quietly, "you can always talk to me about anything." There was something in his tone that made me shiver. It wasn't just a teacher offering support to a student. It felt like an invitation to cross a line that neither of us had dared to acknowledge before. I swallowed hard, my mind racing with what he was really saying, and more importantly, what was I supposed to do with that before? Taking a step back, he said, "That's all for now," and his voice went back to its normal, even tone. I nodded, barely able to form words, and quickly gathered my things as I left the classroom. My heart was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had just changed between us that couldn't be undone. The next few days went by in a blur. Every time I walked into Mr. Rogers' classroom, the tension between us seemed to grow stronger, but it wasn't said. He kept things professional, but there was an undercurrent to every glance, every brief interaction. One afternoon after the last class of the day, I stayed behind to finish some work. All the other students had already left, leaving only Mr. Roger and me in the room. It was very quiet, but neither of us seemed to mind. "I've noticed you've been staying late lately," he said from his desk, not looking up from his work. I paused, not sure what to say. "I just like the quiet. It helps me." Pay attention as he walked over to my desk. His commanding presence made the air shift, and he leaned down just close enough that I could feel the weight of his words. "You don't have to stay late," he said softly, "but I don't mind if you do." My heart raced. His words, though simple, had a meaning I wasn't sure how to interpret. Was he just being kind, or was there something else I couldn't tell? For a long moment, we were both silent, the space between us charged with something that wasn't said. Then, as if realizing he'd said too much, "You should go home," he said in a more formal tone. "It's getting late." I nodded. As I quickly gathered my things and left the room, I knew that things had changed. We had crossed a line, even if we hadn't said it out loud. And with each day that went by, I wondered how far we would go. The next week, everything felt different. Mr. Roger continued to act professionally, but the tension between us was higher. Every look, word, and action seemed to carry more weight than it should have. I stayed late more often, as if I were waiting for something to happen one afternoon as I packed up my things after class. Mr. Roger called me again. "I wanted to talk to you about something," he said in a serious but calm voice. I walked over to his desk, my heart already racing. "I've noticed the change," he said, locking eyes with me. "You've been staying late and lingering after class." He paused, as if he were thinking about what to say next. "I don't want you to misunderstand." The word felt heavy in the air. As I stared at him, I didn't know what to say. "I care about all my students," he said in a softer voice. "But I've realized that things have become complicated between us." I swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in my throat. This was the moment I'd been dreading, but part of me had been waiting for it. I want to make sure nothing happens that could cross any lines. You're a smart student, and I don't want to risk that, he said in a strong but not mean voice. His words hit me. Whatever the strange unspoken thing between us was, he was drawing the line now. I nodded, trying to keep a neutral face, even though I was feeling a lot of different emotions inside. I understand, I whispered, and he gave me a small, almost sad smile, as if he was glad I wasn't pushing back. Good, he said softly. It's better this way with that. He dismissed me, and I left the classroom for what felt like the 100th time. But this time was different. I knew that the door to whatever had been building between us was now closed. As I walked down the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just ended. There had been a connection, a brief, almost imperceptible thread between us, and now it was gone. In the days that followed, I felt lighter, though part of me missed the thrill of that unspoken tension, but I knew it was for the best. Sometimes things are better left unspoken, and